Hello.
Now you can hear me. Yes, I can even hear me. I've been asked to say a few words in introduction to our guest, Himayat Inayati. He comes from Asheville, North Carolina. He is a senior teacher in the Inayati order. I have known Himayat for many years now. All I can say in introduction is that I hope you'll find, as I find, that he is a very wonderful teacher, that he will give very basic and important techniques in order for you to be able to come more fully into yourself and to open your heart. I have been fortunate also to study with Himayat myself. He has been offering some very special online courses through his organization, universalawakening.org, that you might also enjoy to sign up for. This semester, we've been studying about many of the ancient Sufis and their teachings, which has been really quite wonderful. And it's kind of an international fellowship where we get to communicate with people from as far away as Germany and New Zealand. So I think that you might find that interesting to investigate. But today, I think that you will find that this program will be a very good introduction to the path of Sufism and to the path of opening the heart. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Himayat among us. Thank you. I don't know if you still need some.
Just, I think you're good. Just try that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sort of?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I would like to thank Swamiji and the Vedanta Society and also the Inayati Order of Rhode Island for hosting me. And in listening to Swamiji, I realize what a great honor it is to be able to speak here. So, and coming into the room, I'm sure that many of you felt the very fine vibrations that were here from all of the great meditations that have been done before us. This is a kind of a convergence of two rivers, the Vedantic Hindu tradition and then the Sufi tradition. And interestingly enough, the Inayati order is actually out of India originally. So that this coming together between the Swamis and the Sufis has happened throughout the centuries, and it's happening once again today. And this weekend, the celebration tomorrow is very apt. It, of course, is celebrating the wondrous and very inspiring speech by Swami Vivekananda in the World Fair, the Congress of World Religions in the late 1800s in Chicago. He astounded, he was a very young man actually, and he astounded the thousands of people who came with his spirit and also the universality of his vision, the vision he articulated. And his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, embodied that vision quite literally. Went through all these different stages of going through what the Sufis would call the Risalat, all of the prophets, and some of the gods and goddesses, Kali and others, in his own physicality, in his own consciousness. So it wasn't just preaching a message, but actually was a living embodiment of that message, and the most amazing mode of experience possible for a human being. So when Swami Vivekananda said, our path is based on experience, and not on belief, but experience which can be tested. And this very much is the tradition also that the Sufis bring to this discussion. Pir Vilayat was my teacher, and he very much was involved with the discourse between science and spirituality. What does science find? What has science found? What is science finding? And then what is the great contemplatives? What did they articulate about this as well? And it was always something that he was very enthused by. You could count on him to be talking about his father, Hazrat Khan, quoting him, and then a few minutes later, maybe David Bohm or Ilya Prigogine or somebody else he would be talking about as well, all in the same paragraph. So there's this great concept which we call God, and that is a word. Each of us, it means something to each of us. The Swami went through some of the words that the Sufis use for God. The one word would be reality, the ultimate reality, hak. Another one is existence, sheer existence. Mula Sadra called God sheer existence. He said, first there must be existence. For anything, there must first exist. So, wajud, W-U-J-U-D, wujud. So, Ibn al-Arabi said, each of us must first have, in this path, our personal Lord, find our personal Lord, develop our own personal relationship to this reality, to build a ladder, a scaffolding from which we can move ever more deeply within it, realize it ever more deeply. So, and then he pointed out that, and the Sufis are very much into, and we're going to get to the path of love, the path of the heart, path of divine intimacy. And Rumi said, I do not care at the end of this life, he said, I do not care if I am in heaven or hell, as long as I sit in the lap of the beloved. So it was like, do not bargain with God. God, without cause gave you being, and without cause give it back. So we have this great tradition, these great traditions actually. And there's a concept also in Sufism about the perfection of the human. It's called the Insan Kamal. And Ibn al-Arabi said that there are actually two insans. Now, one insan is the human, the individual human, who has arrived at this condition of perfection. And then he said, and then the second insan is the totality of humanity. That humanity itself holds within its total body that which we call perfection. And then he said, God, in commenting on a verse from the Quran, he said, God turned a face toward each of you, and in so doing endowed each of you with a unique mode of knowing. In other words, no other creature in existence knows the way you know. So, obviously then, if that's true, your Lord is going to be uniquely different than anybody else's, because you know differently than anybody else. And then to make it even more interesting, if it needed to be, he said, and in each instant, God creates you afresh. He said, in each instant, he removes the burden of knowing from you, only to invest you in even greater perfection. So it's his theory of recurrent creativity. So we can't even rest in knowing who we think we are or what we thought we were, because we keep being born afresh in each instant. A new being and a new mode of knowing. So that is one, and also, as many of you who do study Hazrat Khan know, he also talked about the ocean and the waves, just like this Swamiji talked about the ocean and the waves. And each manifestation is a wave. And then, of course, that wave comes and it goes and it comes back again, fresh, refreshed, and looking around from, the Sufis would call it, a completely different maqam, different vantage point, of a different way of understanding. And we're speaking about each of you, each of you. I have been the headmaster of some private schools in my time, and they started from preschool all the way up through high school. And in the preschool, we would always, and that means like 3 years old and 4 years old and 5 years old. And by the way, Hazrat Khan used to call anybody under 5 a baby. He said, an infant. You were an infant until 5. And I think the reason for that was because the baby is so imbued with divine essence. The field of the baby is so vast. And slowly it collects itself as it begins to individuate. And you see that collection taking place. But in any case, each year there would be a moving forward, of course, and we'd give a certificate to each of these 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And I collected a saying by the great cellist Pablos Casals. And in it he said, in all of time there has never been anyone like you. In all the present moment there is nobody like you. In all of the future there never will be anyone like you. You are a marvelous treasure. And of course it's on their little certificate. Now people said to me, aren't you going to make them into egomaniacs? You know? I said, if I gave one of them only the certificate, yes. But they noticed everybody got the same certificate. Everyone is a marvelous treasure, and not just the one. So you could say the Sufi is really intrigued by the marvelous treasures. Intrigued and curious about those marvelous treasures. Wondering about those marvelous treasures. Why do those marvelous treasures exist? Because they do exist. If you don't believe they exist, just go to the preschool room and they will let you know they exist. And they grow, as we all know, because we've seen them grow. There must be something sacred about that journey from the unknown to the field of the mother. Hazrat Khan said the mother is the teacher of the prophet. The mother is the first teacher. The baby's in the field of the mother. And it is union. It is a unity field. The baby looks at the mother and sees itself. But somehow, at some point, the baby has to say no to the mother. No. And the no to the mother is a yes to the baby. And then it begins the discussion of individuation. Precipitating out of the field of unity into a new realm of existence. There must be something really precious about that journey into individuation, something sacred, something extremely important about the individuation process. And we can explain it in many different ways, but there must be even something sacred to that which has created all of this, for that to be longed for that to be imagined, for that to be existentiated. And in fact, there is a hadith, which means the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, where the people came to the Prophet and said, why did God create in the first place? And in that hadith, which is it's been on the top 5 of the charts amongst the Sufis for 1,000 years, which means it's a really hot hadith, you know. So, we were a hidden treasure and desired to be known. We were a hidden treasure and desired to be known. Sometimes it's interpreted, we were a hidden treasure and longed to be known. And then sometimes it's interpreted, we were a hidden treasure and loved to be known. Henry Corbin, who is the great translator of Ibn al-Arabi, had a chapter called The Pathos of God, the pathetic God, the lament of God. God, in its loneliness, wished to be known. So, there must be something about this process of individuation, and out of which is birthed different modes of consciousness, different modes of knowing. And then the question would be, in terms of intimacy, how many ways may I know thee? And the beloved would say, in an infinite realm of possibilities. So the journey of the Sufi is toward knowing the beloved. And how many ways may we know thee? And that is why it's called the path of the heart. The path of the heart. Because God wishes to be seen in truth. That which we call God, that which we call reality, that which we call existence, wishes to be known in truth. And we'll go a little more about this in our meditations as the day progresses. I want to say a few more words and then we'll lead you in another meditation. So, one aspect of Sufism, perhaps one of the most primary of all faculties of the soul in Sufism, is called the intellect. And the intellect is not what most of us in modern parlance think. People think, well, we often use a saying, they're overly intellectual, which means too cerebral, too abstract, blue sky thinking, or whatever, you know, not down to earth, overly intellectual. But that is that's actually a mistake. The intellect to the Sufi, the concept of the intellect to the Sufi goes all the way back to, Plato and Socrates. And it may even go back even further into the Hermetic tradition in Egypt. And it comes into Sufism through a man named Dolnan Mizri out of Egypt and his student Sal al-Tustari. The intellect holds 3 sub-faculties within it. One is the reasoning faculty, which Sheikh Shahabuddin Chwardi called the discursive faculty. That is what we normally mean when we talk about intellect. The second is creative imagination, the faculty of creative imagination, which represents something extremely profound. In Sufism, they call it alam al-mithal, the meeting place, where the information from the depths of being meets the information from the surface. And those two modes of information meeting, birth, whole new modes of possibilities. And then it just is a question of the intensity behind those possibilities, whether they manifest or not. The spiritual intensity. There's a deeper faculty within both, beyond even the reasoning faculty of the intellect and the creative imagination of the intellect. The Sufis call that the heart, the subtle heart. And there's different aspects of the subtle heart, but in this case, we're talking about what's called Latifa Sirriya, S-I-R-R-I-Y-A, the subtle secrets. And a great Sufi named Bastami said, the heart has a light of its own, which means it can see. He said, the heart has a light of its own. It is the light of God, the secrets that God placed there. And then he said, when the light of the heavens flows upon the light of the heart, it is a light upon a light. So we will go into this heart seeing, this heart knowing. As part of our adventure today. But I will say a couple more words first. So let's go back to the reasoning, the mind. The mind obviously has a very sacred part to play in this whole aspect of consciousness, and naming. But the Sufis would say the mind's job is to represent what it knows. So it's representation. For example, but representation is not the reality. Representation is not the presence. It's a representation. Like in the word pencil, P-E-N-C-I-L, it refers to something everybody in this room understands, but in that word there is no graphite, there's no wood, there's no yellow paint, there's no green number 2, there's no little piece of tin with little green circles, there's no little rubber. There's nothing. It's just a word, P-E-N-C-I-L. Only when the pencil is present in your hand do you have its reality. Up until then, you just have a mental representation. So we have not just the pencil in our hand. And Swami Vivekananda talked about sensing, experiencing these presences very solidly. We not only have this pencil, but we have something in our hearts as well that is present. We have something in the depth of our being which is present. And the mind can be developed to the point where it can name it, where it can describe it. But in all of its naming and all of its describing, it's not the reality. It's just a representation. And each of us, because we are going to know in a different way, are going to name it differently. We're all going to see it differently. I have given workshops for many years, and at one point I gave a very specific training in healing. At one point I was involved with the Sufi healing order for about 20 years. And in that training I had very specific objectives. And so we would meet, and it was a 4-year training, so I mean, it was very specific. And people would take notes. And one time, very early on in this process, I was in California, and in the group, there was a group of about 30 people, and in that group there was a court stenographer. And her job professionally was to take notes. I mean, the law, the case was to some degree determined on, or future cases were determined on how accurately she took the notes of what was going on in the courtroom. So she was a professional. She wasn't a Sufi, however, so she didn't understand the technical language that I was using, these Arabic words. And for some strange reason, perhaps out of deference, she never raised her hand and even asked, what are you saying? She just wrote. So anyway, at the end of the seminar, she came to me and said, I would love to share my notes with the other students. And I said, can I see those notes? And sure. And I looked at them and I was quite amazed. And I said, thank you very much, but let me think about it. And then in the same group, there was a psychiatrist who's also a professional and takes notes based on what she's hearing her clients say and what's going on there. And she refers back to her notes before she sees her client the next time. She also shared with me her notes, and I was also quite amazed at what I saw there. One of the things that I saw was there were two entirely different seminars going on. Seriously, I mean, it wasn't even a joke. It's just, that's the truth. There was two different seminars going on. And I looked around the room, there's 30 people. I knew there was 30 different seminars going on. And when you're trying to arrive at a certain point together, it could be Babylon if I left town and they all shared their notes. He said this, no, he said that, no, he said this. It's in my notes. So it forced me to actually write the notes myself and give it to people so that they would have my notes. Why do but I say that with absolute respect to everybody in the room. Of course there was 30 different seminars going on. Each is endowed with their own mode of knowing. Each of us is constructing within our consciousness our own realm of possibilities. We're hearing what we hear based upon where we're hearing it from, based upon where is our consciousness at the moment. And that is why we have all these different religions. And that is why we have all these different ways. And how many ways may I know thee? And I'll just say one more thing for now, and then we'll do a practice. So there's another tradition, which at the end of time, and I suppose time ends sometime, at the end of time, God comes to humanity in a guise. And nobody recognizes God. So then God puts on another guise. And nobody recognizes God. And this goes on for, well, it can't go on for some time because time has already ended, but it goes on. So, and at some point, part of humanity recognizes God, said, oh, that's our God. And then, but everybody else is confused. And then more guises come. And finally, another part of humanity recognizes God. And finally, when it's all over, everybody recognizes God. So what does this mean, this story? Well, it means, obviously, that we each have our own framework for God. Each of us have our own, what does this mean to us, God? And how do we relate to that? And this is part of this grand discussion that which we call God or reality has evoked through existence. There's a saying which I think fits into this somewhere, and it's actually by a cosmologist, Brian Swim. And he says, first the universe was nothing but molten fire, and now it sings arias. And I think that is just a wonderful understanding, in a certain way, of this manifestation of knowing and reflection. Well, I lied. There's one more little story to tell, and then we will do a practice. So I told this story yesterday, but it's a good story. Say it again. So one time I was invited to give a sermon to a Southern Baptist church. I live in the mountains of western North Carolina. And this church was in South Carolina, and it was about an hour and a half drive to the church. So it was a 3-hour round trip. And I was at first curious as to why Southern Baptists, who tend to be more conservative, would want somebody named Himayat to give a sermon. But in those days, I used to put on big conferences, believe it or not, where I'd invite swamis and rabbis, and Native Americans and all kinds of people to come, scientists to come and to talk about healing and spirituality. I invited Christians as well. And so one of the Christians was on the vestry, and I found out that, of course, ministers take vacations, and then the vestry's hard up to find a replacement. And she thought it would be entertaining at best if Himayat came and gave a sermon to the South Baptist Church. And I said, so how much time do I have for this sermon? And she said, 20 minutes. And I thought, what? It takes 3 hours. You're on for a 20-minute sermon. But I was intrigued because I'd never been invited to give a sermon at a South Baptist church, and I was afraid I never would be invited again. And as a matter of fact, I haven't been. But anyway, so I was intrigued enough to say, okay, I'll come. But I said, can I squeeze a little more time? Sufis are good at bargaining. Can I squeeze, what comes after the 20 minutes? Oh, coffee and donuts. It's fellowship time. We don't budge on that. That's it. It's like, we don't give on the coffee and donut section. You just got to do it all in 20 minutes. And I thought, well, okay, so 20 minutes. This better be good. So I came into the church, and there was about 200 people there, husbands and wives, because all the kids were sent to Sunday school for their 20 minutes. And I said, I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and you're going to cross it today, and you can never go back. And that got their interest. And then I led them on this meditation, which I'm about to lead you on, of the heart. And I said, I know that many of you believe you have a heart, and you talk about the heart. Maybe on February 14th you draw a heart and give it to your wife, or your husband, or your child, or your parent. But probably no one has showed you how to access your heart consciously, or how to use your heart as a compass for the path you're on, for the journey you're taking. And so, of course, all it is a word, heart. But today, you're going to experience the heart. You're going to learn how to access the heart. And at that point, you can never say ever again, no one ever showed me. And you will have crossed the line. And so at a certain point, we went through the practices, and which we're about to do. And I won't ask you the same questions because I already I'm going to give you the answers. So why? But anyway, so at the end, I said, well, how many? Well, maybe I will ask you. But anyway, I said, how many people here feel a little warmer or softer in this area having done this practice? And all the women raised their hand, and then the husbands raised their hand. And I said, okay, so how many people would prefer to live their life feeling this is warm and soft rather than hard and cold? And of course, all the women raised their hand, and the husbands raised their hands. It was kind of unfair to the men, I have to admit, but anyway, because their wives were watching how they were handling this. So, but, I said Sufism is a path of the heart, but even among the Sufis, sometimes I don't think that they apply this compass as often as they could. Sometimes I wonder if we say we're on the path of the heart, but how do we know that we're on the path of the heart? Do we actually, there's something I call the discipline of the heart. Do you actually pull out the compass and see, is it pointing north or is it pointing south, or is it not pointing at all, just spinning around? That's a good question, actually. And I think when we're done here today, you'll see that actually it's extremely easy to access the heart. And it's also very easy to understand how to use it as a compass. So we're going to begin. So first we'll just, like the Swamiji led us, just watch our breath for a moment. We're going to breathe through our nose, not our mouth. We do breathe through both, but the mouth is good for chopping wood. I live in the mountains. It's good for running or picking up boulders, labor. The breath of the nose is finer. In Murshid, Hazrat Khan said, the finer the breath, the more subtle the planes it penetrates. And he also said the breath is life and light, L-I-G-H-T. It's a light. So what it touches, it animates life, and it illumines. So we can actually use the breath as a tool for assessment. That's my conclusion. He said it was life and light, and I said, well, if it's life and light, we can use it as a tool for assessment. That would be my commentary. So just watch your breath through your nose for a moment, and as you're present to your breath, there's a concept that I use that I've got actually from focusing Eugene Jetland, which is felt sense and felt shift. A felt sense is just what it says, it's a sense. And a felt shift is whatever you're sensing changes. It either intensifies, or it disappears, or it moves into a different kind of a feeling. So we're going to watch our breath for a moment and watch for a felt sense of our breath, and then watch for any kind of felt shifts. And one thing you may be able to experience is your breath, which is not your breathing. The breathing is the physiology of the breath. Breath is that which comes and that which goes. So, as you're present to your breath, it begins to become slower and finer. So that's a felt sense and a felt shift. And even as it becomes finer, some of you may experience feelings or experience vibrations within the breath. That would be a felt shift. And when you experience the vibrations within the breath, you might experience vibration throughout your physicality, throughout your being, throughout your body and your mind. A feeling of life. Hazrat Khan called it magnetism. When the mind experiences this, it collects itself, becomes focused. It still thinks, but there's no snow. Not a lot of rapid thinking, just clear, or what the Buddhists call lucidity, clear, light. I call it slow wave thinking, focused. All this is possible through presence to the breath. And now what I'd like you to do, if you can feel that breath, if you can experience that fineness of breath, I want you to do it with your eyes open. Continue that practice with eyes open, so that you can actually, with your eyes are open, looking at the world around you, still be present to the breath coming and going, and to the vibrations of the breath. And it's as though you're plugged into the source of energy. The breath is just feeding you. Eyes open. Now, one thing they say, Sufism, the Sufi brings to the world a living God. They say the Sufi brings God right into the marketplace. So that means the eyes have to be open, just like the Swamiji led that meditation with the eyes open. And then the next thing is watching your breath, eyes open, and then soften your cheeks, because we get this very drawn look on our face, like that could scare somebody. So we want, it's like maybe we're going to have a stroke or something like that. So soften the cheeks, but watch the breath. Could you imagine going into life, into regular discourse with life, with people, watching your breath. Could you imagine listening to somebody, watching your breath, getting fed by this energy, infused with life, even while you're listening and talking with somebody, conversing, maybe even bargaining. I mean, if we're going to bring God into the marketplace, there has to be some bargaining. So, can we do that with our consciousness, watching our breath, being fed? Okay. And then now, put your index finger at the top of the sternum, bone in the center of your chest. Come down your hands with where your little finger is on the sternum. And that is the area where your little finger is that I want you to close your eyes and begin to massage that with the breath. So you breathe in, and you cast your breath into that area, and you breathe out. So you're examining that area with the light of your breath. So I said massaging it, but you're kind of sensing it with the light of your breath. You're feeling. Now, at first it may be, we talked about the imaginal realm. At first it might be almost, I imagine there's something there. But then we talked about felt sense. All of a sudden there's a certain something there that you can actually experience. A subtle plexi. You breathe on it, in breath and out breath, caressing it like the morning breeze caresses your cheek. And then it becomes more clear to you where you would like to be breathing. And this is called a felt shift. It's no longer an imaginal area. There's a loci, there's something there that you're actually relating to with your breath. And the ancient ones call this breathing on the ember of the heart, blowing on the ember of the heart. And this actually is a practice in all the great traditions. And you know that when you blow on an ember, it ignites. And this area you may experience a slight warmth to the area. It could also be a feeling of congestion. It's like maybe when you were young, when you had a cold, your mother put Vicks on your chest to penetrate and decongest. So you can have this feeling of this area being congested, but as the breathing penetrates and massages the in-breath and the out-breath opens and releases, it begins to decongest. And there's a warmth, and that warmth, of course, is radiant discharge. And the out-breath, the Buddhists would call the sword of liberation. It's cutting loose all this stuff that's on the outer surface of the heart. Letting go. You might feel a lump there, or even a pain, or a sorrowing. You can just stay with the breath. And as this area warms, it softens. And softening is a subjective realization of space developing. At first, it's just kind of more space within the chest cavity. Let the in-breath penetrate and go more deep into this heart space. As it does, the perceiver, who we normally think of as being lodged in our head, descends into the heart. As the breath penetrates the heart space, the perceiver, the witness, can look around from the vantage point of the heart. And sees this space of the heart. And at first it's in the chest cavity, but as you watch that space, it unfurls and moves beyond the body. It's in the body, but it's outside the body. It traverses the body, but it's not the body. It's the heart. And as it unfurls, it traverses what we call three-dimensionality, but it's not three-dimensionality, it's another dimension. We call it the dimension of the heart. We call it what Ibn Arabi would allude to as the sea without a distant shore. A vast space of the heart. And this space is not an empty space. It has substances within it. For instance, there's a sense of buoyancy or lightness. Sense of hope, joy, peace. This is what Bastami meant when he said God placed his secrets here. And then when you feel that warmth and softness and space, you can open your eyes. The first thing you'll notice, Pirbalat used to say, was when you open your eyes, first there's a reluctance to open your eyes because you feel like you're going to leave behind something very special. And secondly, you know that the objects in the world outside you have a strong gravitational pull upon your consciousness. They pull you out of the inner world into the outer world. But we can mediate that with presence and breath. You can, as Rumi said, I sit on a wall, one leg in this world and one leg in the other. So you breathe and stay in the space of the heart, even as you are looking around the room. You're aware of the outer world. But you can still maintain that with consciousness, with presence and breath. And you can even play with it. And I'll say something about play in a minute. But for example, you could go to your breakfast table, bringing your heart with you to the breakfast table, and just breathe. Maybe there'd be someone at the breakfast table besides the food. Or maybe not, but anyway, you breathe and stay in the heart. We'll talk about this a little more. So the first question I would have to ask you is, how many could feel something here? And this just, I'm not going to ask you what, just something. Okay. And then the next would be, how many felt it become softer or warmer because you were doing the practice a little softer, a little warmer? All right. Okay. And then, of course, my last question, pretending you're a Baptist, is how many would prefer to live your life? have a little soft and warm here rather than cold and hard, you know. So, well, that's a ridiculous question. You know? That's the kind of question you ask when you're giving a sermon, you know. But I just gave you what? I gave you a compass. I gave you a literal compass. The Swamiji talked about practicality. This is very practical. This is a practical meditation. It's a compass. And we'll talk about how to use this compass more. I want to say something about play, and then I'll pause for some comments, questions, answers, whatever you would like to use the pause for. So, you know, human beings research everything, and of course, lots of people research play. People have wondered why little beings play. Well, this particular research was why do baby mammals play? And of course, humans are mammals too. But they noticed that not just baby humans play, but little puppies play, little kittens play, baby lambs play. Actually, all the baby animals play. So they were wondering, why? Why do baby animals play? And of course, there's all kinds of possible reasons and theories, and that's what science is a great theory waiting to be disproved. But why do baby animals play? One working theory they came up with, which I love, is this is the way baby animals explore the unknown. Because when you're a baby, in this world, everything's unknown. Baby doesn't know. So play is a way of exploring. Now there's another word that they came up with besides play, and that's called settle. They noticed that eventually every little baby animal would stop being so playful and would settle. I can give you a real concrete example. So I raise sheep, and at one point I had a little pen by my house where I'd keep the mother sheep when they're about to have their babies because sometimes they needed help. And one day I was sitting on my porch watching them because I learned so much from animals, really. And the night before, I had been coming from town. It was about 11 o'clock at night. And the main highway was just filled, bumper to bumper, with cars. And they were all filled with teenagers. And they were doing something that we used to call cruising. You know, just looking around for something. Didn't know what, but we'd recognize it when we saw it, you know. So anyway, just remember that. So then there are even little teenage sheep. You know, there's a baby sheep. They're about the same size as a human baby, about 7-8 pounds. And the baby sheep were all sitting next to their mothers, right next to their mother, because mammals like to touch. And the mothers were just sitting there, very settled. They'd eaten their food, and they had nothing to do but be sheep. But the teenage lambs were off by themselves, and they'd found a hole in the fence. And they got through the fence, and they were going up and down the driveway together. Seriously. They were cruising. They were looking for, they didn't know what, but they were looking for something. And interestingly enough, the little baby lambs who were sitting next to their mother were not looking at their mothers. They were watching the teenage lambs going up and down and you could see in their little heads, now this has possibilities. So, yeah, this is possible. You know, this could be something greater life here. But settling is, okay, this is my known world and I accept it. This is the world I've explored. This is the world I know. This is the world I will live in. That's called settling. Human beings don't just play, we too settle. It's true. All you have to do is to get to be my age and look in the mirror. and you know that you're starting to settle, or you've been settling for quite a while. So, meditation is a way, if you believe in Al-Arabi, which we're born afresh each moment, is a mode of exploring the unknown. So our meditations should be playful. Otherwise, they're just replications of what we know. The same old meditation. The formula. The ritual. What we've been told, or what we know. What we've experienced yesterday. Or what we experienced last week. So, just something to share with you about play and meditation. Because, as the Sufis would say, God wishes to be known in an infinitude of ways. They call that divine intimacy, becoming intimate. Ultimately, intimacy leads to what's called union. Okay, so we've done a little practice. I've said a few words. Before we take a break, it would be a good time for you to say a few words. So do you have any comments or questions? Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And quite respectfully, I'd like to consider the word new, it's being playful in the meditations and all that. And of course, new usually means unprecedented. So, the body, does the body come into play as a possible ingredient for newness? And doesn't science and these other, whatever you mentioned, what we all think of science and limitations of sciences and whatnot, and the definitions that are given to things related to the body, aren't they limitations that can stifle the newness, the unprecedented for the body? Or is the body not supposed to be an ingredient in this whole realm of new thought and freshness and coming alive every minute, and et cetera, et cetera? I mean, we have such a fixed perception of body, and what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do. It's utterly outlined by every authoritative discipline, so-called, that we live in.
Well, actually, the frontiers of the body and our understanding are expanding daily. And as a matter of fact, the body is composed of not just the food we eat, which was talked about earlier, but also of the thoughts we think, our memories, our actions, our past. And not even just our past, but in epigenetics, the past of our forefathers are all within the flesh. However, there is an understanding now in neuroscience that this hardwiring, which we call neural pathways, can actually be changed with new behaviors, new thoughts. So the body is infinitely more plastic, and so is the mind, than anyone ever imagined before. So far from it being set in cement, it has all kinds of possibilities.
So that pencil, which is a concept of pencil,
Yeah.
not yet labeled and all of that, is being defined and understood through our sensation of the body,
Sure.
which is questionable.
Yes.
Very questionable.
So,
Because they can be erroneous in perception,
could be.
and quite frequently are. Because they're limited by the definition of the body and what it can do and what it does. So, I think, as a consideration, the senses are not reliable source of, measuring our experience or
You know, I would tend to agree with you, and I have to hasten to add that the only tools we have, basically, outside of consciousness itself. So whether they're faulty or not, we can rely on them in as much as we can rely on them and just stay tuned for new possibilities. But, you know, people may have faulty perception, but as long as they can get around in the world, they can function. So we look at different things at different levels. And part of the reason we have a body, biologically, is to be able to exist on this planet. And so our senses are there to help us orient ourselves around the planet. And our outer senses are there to orient us in the outer world, but we have inner senses as well that can also orient us and do orient us. And that's what meditation also trains us in, is how to appreciate and utilize our inner sensibility.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed this a lot. And so I'm going to ask you sort of about, I want to share what I'm feeling. And
Okay.
so I never know exactly where anything is when I'm told to feel this and that. So
Yeah, me either.
I definitely felt a spot and warm.
Okay.
And so I'm going to assume that's my ember of the heart. And then my awareness went lower, and there's like this pressure there. It's not bad, but it definitely is, it's different. This is more airy or more spacious, and then it's like
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And so two questions. One, if you have comments, and secondly, how might I work with this? Because it seems to me that this is workable
Yes.
awareness.
Well, I don't know about working, but let's talk about playing.
Yeah.
So basically, our consciousness is developed through information. And new information, we have to be open to receive new information, and that may challenge even old information, very likely. But we can have the same tools. We can apply the same tools that we've been applying, which is breath and presence. So I use the breath as a light and as something to animate. So it's like a tool of inner assessment when we're looking. And then presence is the presence of your consciousness. Your consciousness is using the tool of breath to assess a certain area, but it's also being present to that area even as it is using the breath to assess it. And so I'm saying, well, what is there? Is this just my imagination, or is there a feeling, or is it a sensation, or is it an emotion, or is it all of those things? And so then you have to pause and receive. You have to allow yourself to be informed. And that's called more carefully assessing. And that's what I would suggest throughout, is to carefully allow it to inform you. And in all these situations, it's very helpful to have support, someone to reflect with, just because it is. We are human beings, after all. And it's nice to have someone to reflect with who actually has some sense of the map, and maybe even the territory. So, and because we said earlier, quoting Ibn al-Arabi, that we all are a unique creation, we can really, Pirvalaya, my teacher, used to say, well, I think he was quoting somebody else, but the map is not the territory. So we can have all these different subtle faculties, and we call that the map. But the experience is the territory, and everybody in this room is going to have different experiences. So, including whoever's your guide or whoever you're reflecting with is probably going to have different experiences as well. But hopefully they have enough experience and sensitivity to be able to support you in more accurately understanding what it is that you're seeking to understand. Hopefully that made sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You just mentioned that the body is not just food, it is also the thoughts are also
Yes,
behind it.
that's true.
This is very beautiful in the sense in Vedanta also we hear the same thing, that is food and also thoughts in different contexts.
Yes.
Now I was just wondering, just to draw some parallel, in Sufism, what do you think about consciousness in the sense, or the thought layer, or the subtle layer, for less animate objects, let's say plants and vegetables, or this chair? How do you look at it in terms of consciousness and thoughts? Do you also?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I cannot speak for all Sufis for the reasons I already gave, which is everybody's unique creation. So I can't say this is what the Sufis would say, but I can quote certain Sufis, what they did say, particularly the ones I like best. And the reason I like them best is because they confirm what I know. What I know. Or they lead me into areas of knowing that I would never have suspected without their support. So it works for me. That's the bottom line. And Ibn Arabi is somebody I go to for that. He insisted that every element of existence is sentient. It's alive. It's aware. Not only sentient, but he insisted that every single aspect of creation, right down into the elemental levels, was busy glorifying its creator. He said each glorifies in its own way. So everything's an act of divine glorification. So not just aware, but glorifying, each in its own way. So we can go on quite poetically about that forever, but I'll give you an example, because I like to give practical examples and not just have a poetic. So one day, I live in the mountains in the country. I've lived in the country almost all my life except for 7 years. So clearly I like it there. And I'm always learning from nature. And I was doing a practice that's a primary practice of the Sufis called zikr. La ilaha illallah. That's a formula, but we'll go into that later. Anyway, I'm doing the zikr. It's at night. It's in August, and the stars are shining. And in August, the crickets start to sing at nighttime. The little black bugs. Wave upon wave. Wave upon wave under the stars. And I'm in a certain mood, because that's what happens when you go do zikr. And so I'm in a mood, and I'm listening to these bugs. And I remember Ibn Arabi saying, each in its own way is busy about glorifying its creator. So I'm listening. And then I do the zikr a little more, and it seems to me, of course I was in a certain mood, but it seemed to me in that mood that one of those crickets was challenging me. You know, the Zen people have these fights and stuff. This cricket started, as I was doing zikr, getting more intense with its glorification. It started to, and I was like, how could that kind of energy go through that little brain? I mean, that little tiny brain, you know. But he was going more intense. So I tested my theory, and I did zikr a little longer. And he started going higher and higher. And I was doing it, he was doing it. And finally, I bowed to him and gave up. I said, you are the master. So I could not believe it. But that's a practical, I think that's practical. That's a practical example of how in nature things glorify. One time I was driving a car. I saw this plant. You were talking about plants. There was a bush. It was on fire with light. I almost lost it. I almost drove off the road. I was so amazed by that plant, just gushing with light and life. Surely it was alive. Yeah. Yeah.
On the one hand, religion recommends having faith which means that something is known, or as you put it, having a formula. And on the other hand, you said it's about exploring something new. How do you reconcile those?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm going to have to paraphrase Swami Vivekananda because I'm not as great a student of him as Swamiji is, by any means. But I remember him saying something like, no, it's not faith, it's experience that we are based our whole enterprise upon. So, just wanted to say that. Is it a good paraphrase? Yeah. So, yeah, it is experience. And actually that's what Sufism says too. The Sufis say it is not, Sufism is not based on concepts, it's based on experience. Yeah.
In the sense of, Sufism and Vedanta and Buddhism, it's Eastern philosophies that have now become, well, they're planted now here in this Western society that seems to be not so full of heart at times. It seems sometimes to be very crass and very cruel, and looking out for its own materialistic benefit. Does Sufism evolve with that, or does it stay as a rooted concept the same as it has always been, or is it moving on to try to influence? I don't know how to say it. Influence the Western way of being, or to adopt it, or how does this fit into our American culture?
I am always surprised at what I discover among people in America. I travel all around the world many times. I'm going, in fact, to Germany in a month, so I'm always surprised. I'll give you an example. So my wife practices the technique of healing that I developed, and she was at one point in her life, she was supposed to be, her job was to verify that somebody who was disabled could still get workers' compensation because they truly were disabled. And so this woman came to her, a very simple woman, an American. And of all things, she was disabled because she'd been hit by a garbage truck. I mean, talk about an insult upon an insult. And my wife was trying to get her to relate at some level. And so finally she decided, she says, why don't we both lie down on the floor and look at the ceiling? So they both lay down on the floor, which the woman thought was pretty weird, but this woman, my wife is a professional. So they're lying on the floor, and my wife is asking her about her life. And pretty soon she starts to weep, this woman. And she said, nobody's ever asked me about my life. To me, you see this materialistic world called America or whatever, but if you look into the heart of the people, it is so alive. There's so much heart there. It's just nobody's asking, but it's right there. So I don't see America necessarily as ultimately materialistic. On the other hand, I will talk a little bit about my teacher, Hazrat Khan, who came from India. And actually, Swami Vivekananda came from India. And they both actually were classical Indian musicians. And he came to India in 1910, a little after the Swami came. And his feeling was that something is birthing on the planet at this time. And when you think about it, in the late 1800s, whether it was the great avatar Ramakrishna, or whether it was Swami Vivekananda's great speech at the Congress of World Religions in Chicago, or whether it was Inayat Khan arriving in New York in 1910, or whether it was the women's suffragette movement, or whether it was the League of Nations being developed, something was developing on the planet in the late 1800s, early 1900s. on the planet, not just in the West. And it's still being developed. It's just that what we see are the bizarre things, the hard things. We do see those things, and they do need to be addressed. But we should not miss the other things as well. So I just wanted to say that about America. Does Sufism evolve? Of course. How could it not? If everything is born afresh. Does America evolve? Of course. How can it not? And does evolution mean a straight trajectory? Well, one Sufi named Abdul Qadir Jilani said the reason we circumambulate the Kaaba is because the spiritual path is not in a straight line. So I don't expect evolution to be a straight line. It's information flowing in multiple directions simultaneously. Some of those lines you might call conservative drag, if you're a liberal. Some of those you might call materialistic, if you're a New Ager. One time Hazrat Khan was on a boat, big ship. And on a ship you have lots of time to talk to strangers. And so somebody was talking to him, and he saw that he had this black hat and a black gown. He kind of reminded him of a Russian Orthodox priest or something. So he figured he was spiritual. So this man immediately said to him, "I don't believe in God." And Hazrat Khan said, "Well, what do you believe in?" "I believe in the material." Hazrat Khan said, "Well, we believe the same. What you call material, I call God." And he wasn't being cute. I mean, he was being literal. So, you know, we have these constructs, and we can get caught up in our own constructs. So we have time for one last comment or question about the heart or Sufism. Yes. I can hardly hear you.
I practice with the heart.
Okay.
When I practice, what comes up are things that are not so beautiful.
Not so beautiful. Surprise, surprise, surprise.
I'm wondering, I guess it's probably a bigger conversation than just a little question, but ways to address that. If you're, so there's warmth and then sort of the dark, sort of shadowy stuff comes through. Is it suggested to just sort of sit with that, or I don't know?
Well, again, I would just go back to what I said to somebody else, but I'll just add something else to it. Wherever there's a light, there's going to be a shadow. And I would suspect the greater the light, the greater the shadow. And as a matter of fact, without shadow and light, there'd be no perception. If it was just all sheer light, you wouldn't see a thing. And there would be no knowing. And that is one reason why the Sufis call them the shadows veils, or the interplay of shadow and light veils. Pure Light used to say the veil is there to protect us from that which we're not yet ready to deal with. But we can be ready to deal with it, and we will be ready to deal with it, and at some point we will deal with it. And so that's the interplay. And of course, shadows are looked at, and shadow material is looked at as a negative. But a lot of times the shadow is a positive that we just don't want to deal with. And this goes back to something like Jacob wrestling with his angel. And I'll give you an example. So I told you I was teaching a certain methodology of healing, and part of it was a process which we called one-to-one processing, which was inquiry and allowing the information to come up and reveal itself more carefully and clearly. And I would meet with people every 6 months. And I came to this one place, and I'd been there in January. This was in June. And this woman that I met, and she said, "Well, you know, since I was with you in January, I've been kind of in a low-grade state of anxiety." Now, a low-grade state of anxiety doesn't sound like a very good state to be in. And I said, "Would you like to work with that piece of anxiety?" "Yes." So we worked with it for a while, and what came up in her process was, well, what I'm experiencing is this power, but I don't perceive myself to be a person of power. So what she's saying is her historical identity was defending itself against the nature of her soul. So the qualities of beingness were emerging, which would dissolve her understanding of herself as not being a person of power. And I understood, often life, in fact, I would say always life, in greater life, is disturbing. No disturbance, no life. I mean, just talk to the little seed trying to get through the earth. No disturbance, no life. So, life is disturbing. I knew something about this woman. I knew that she'd been married for 40 years. I knew that she lived in a little flat in a big city. I knew her husband. I knew that her husband had no problem thinking of himself as a person of power. I know something about marriage. I know how it is that there's a kind of a negotiations that go on, either consciously or unconsciously, to make it work for 40 years. I could imagine her coming back to her flat and saying, well, sweetheart, up for 40 years there's been one person of power in the room, but now there's two. And I could imagine him saying, what does that mean? And then I could imagine some unsettling and disruptive negotiation going on. It's just my imagination, but knowing human beings, it fits. Even though in my own life it would fit. So I could see why that would be disturbing. I could see why somebody may not want to be that for a lot of reasons. So then they're left with denial because they just don't want to pick up what's being offered. So there's just lots of different pieces about the shadow that can be disturbing and distressful and look really awful. It's just part of the discussion. And it reminds me of I have a Tibetan tanka. I actually invited, one of my conferences years ago, I invited the Yeshe Dandan, who was the personal physician of the Dalai Lama. For the first time he came to the United States, I flew him over, and he gave me a tanka. I flew him over to be part of a conference on healing. In that tanka, the Bodhisattva is sitting on a throne, and over the Bodhisattva there's all these angels, and under all these demons. And the Bodhisattva's got his eyes, or her eyes, half open, half closed. And that is us. Eyes open, eyes closed, just like Swamiji and I have been meditating. Eyes open, eyes closed. Sitting on a throne, mediating demons and angels. That's us. That's the heart. The heart is the throne. "12:30. One more question, then we'll go a little over.
I just had a follow on to his question because I noticed that you focused a lot on the example of allowing, for someone to allow themselves to be powerful. He did mention beauty, though.
Mentioned what?
Beauty.
Beauty.
So in this case, could you talk a little bit about someone struggling to accept that they're beautiful?
Wow. That's a big topic. I'm trying to wrap myself around it. I'm trying to figure out exactly how do we go around this beauty thing. Well, it's true, People sometimes struggle with that. And, I don't want to do that question a disservice, but I will say a couple of quick words, and that I acknowledge it's probably a disservice, but we'll then take a lunch break. We can always come back to it. that would be fair game. Because there's a saying in Sufism, God is beautiful and loves beauty. And there's another saying, there's a story of Majnun and Layla. There's 100,000 stories of Majnun. Majnun and Layla are the Sufi equivalent of Romeo and Juliet. And in one of the stories, Layla, and they're in love. Layla's the woman and Majnun is the man. For some strange reason, most of those stories, Majnun is a great prince, who's quite handsome and intelligent and all the fine qualities of life. Sometimes Layla is and sometimes she's not. In one of the stories, she's not. And all of Majnun's friends say, we just don't understand why you keep saying Layla's beautiful, because she's not beautiful. And Majnun says, to see Layla, you have to look through the eyes of Majnun. And so, time for a lunch break.
Thank you, dear Himayat. And we will proceed to lunch.